I have my Mr. Rogers sweater on today, so if you walk outside, you understand why. If you go into our offices, you'll understand why. But it's really not a Mr. Rogers sweater. It just kind of looks that way. We are going to be going back into Joshua and finishing the second part of what I started about two weeks ago. Yeah, about 2 weeks ago. And I hope that some of y'all were here to remember that part as we looked in chapter 3 where Joshua was given a word from God. So he had to take that word and then step out in faith. And then as they began to step out in faith, if you'll remember what was going on, the nation of Israel has been they've been in the wilderness for 40 years. They're now coming to the point where they're going to go into the promised land and begin to take it. We went through the account where the spies were sent in. They met Rahab the harlot. She hides them. They get out. They come back and give a report to Joshua and the armies, and she's going to be protected. And so Joshua tells the nation of Israel to prepare that in 3 days they were going to cross into the promised land. That the Lord told him that he would be crossing the Jordan to take them down to this particular point, cross over the Jordan River, and that they would begin to take the Holy Land, which he had promised to Abraham, and then promised to Moses, reaffirmed the promise to Joshua. And so they are now, what we saw last week was they had to step out in faith. Joshua was told to cross the river, to have the Ark of the Covenant go in front of the nation of Israel. Whenever they would walk through the wilderness, they had a certain format as to how they would walk, and they would be formed as tribes. Do y'all remember that? Several tribes up to the front, and several tribes to the side, several tribes to the back, and the Ark of the Covenant always in the center of the traveling Israelites. And so this was something that was different that they were told to do. And we also talked about the Jordan River. What was going on with the Jordan River at that time? Anybody? It was flooded. It was that time of the year, so it was way over its banks. So instead of being a wide river, it was really an ultra-wide river. And the land would have been muddy. It would have been hard to cross. The water would have been rushing. It would have been a lot faster and a lot swifter. And so what God had told Jacob to do, Joshua, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joshua, what he told Joshua to do was to have the Ark of the Covenant go first and then lead the nation of Israel, and then once they get into the middle of the river, to stop. And so all of these things had to be exercised in faith. God had given Joshua, I'm stuck on Jacob. God had given Joshua the commands. He had to pass those on to the nation of Israel. They had to act upon those commands in faith. They had to trust God. Now, they would have come to this river. They would have seen it rushing. They would have seen how wide it was. They didn't prepare boats. They didn't prepare any of those things. God didn't tell them to prepare those things. God told them to go and prepare to cross the river in 3 days. They wouldn't have had time to prepare enough boats to cross the river. Now, the whole of the nation of Israel probably wasn't thinking, okay, God, what are you going to do? But I'm pretty sure Joshua was expecting God to do something. He just may not have known what it was going to be. But you remember, Joshua and Caleb are the only two from the original set of Israelites that had come out of Egypt that saw God part the Red Sea, and they went through that on dry ground, and then it closed up over the Egyptians. So only Joshua and Caleb would have remembered that. Now, they may have told the preceding or the following generations what had happened. They would have said, hey, they brought us out. God brought us out of Egypt. He parted the Red Sea. He brought water from a rock. Now they would have continued to have been eating the manna and the quail. They would have been continuing to have been provided for God. And you'll see that happens all the way till they get into the promised land. And when they get into the promised land, all of that stops. So they were witnessing the miracles of God. They were anticipating that God would take them through this river. And I don't know if you remember when there's the account of them walking through the wilderness for 40 years. It said their clothes didn't wear out, their sandals didn't wear out, nothing wore out. Whatever they wore, whatever they put on their feet, all of those things lasted. Now, the only thing you'd had to have done is for the kids, you probably had to keep getting something bigger and something bigger and something bigger, because they always grow out of things. But all of those things lasted. So they've seen some miracles of God, but they had never seen God part the water. And so Jacob now tells them, hey, Ark of the Covenant, go forward. All they did was they followed God in faith. Just like Peter stepping out of the boat onto the water when the Lord called him to himself, those people carrying the Ark of the Covenant didn't know that the waters were going to dry up when they stepped into the bank of the Jordan. But the moment they stepped into the bank of the Jordan, about 20 miles up, God stops the water, dries the land so it's not just mud, and the nation of Israel walks across. So the first two things we looked at 2 weeks ago was the command of the word, or the word that was given to Joshua, the faith of the nation of Israel and of Joshua to carry out the command that God gave them. And today in chapter 4, what we're going to look at is the witness of that command. What does that do for the nation of Israel? How does that strengthen them? How does that help them live out the purpose that God has given them? And so what we'll see here is that all that happens becomes a witness to the nation that should have reminded them of God's grace and His goodness. And so I'm going to read the first 9 verses, and then we're going to talk about those, or maybe the first 7, and then we'll talk about that, and then we'll go and try to get through the whole chapter. But does anybody have any questions right now? Okay. I counted to a fast 10. Nobody answered. All right. So chapter 4, reading from the New American Standard. Now when all the nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, take for yourselves 12 men from the people, 1 man from each tribe, and command them, saying, take up for yourselves 12 stones out from here, out of the middle of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet are standing firm, and carry them over with you, and lay them down on the lodging place where you will lodge tonight. So Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the sons of Israel, 1 man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, cross again to the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, and each of you shall take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the son of Israel. Let this be a sign among you, so that when your children ask later, saying, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall say to them, because the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and when it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall become a memorial to the sons of Israel forever. These stones shall become a memorial forever. Back in chapter 3, verse 12, God told Joshua to go and pick 1 man from each tribe to represent that tribe, and he does. And it's just one of those lines that's in there. It's part of the narrative, and you think, why did he have them pick 1 man from each of the tribes? And here in chapter 4, in the narrative, what you see is, once the nation of Israel had gotten across, he says, hey, you 12 men that were chosen before we crossed, you go back out into the middle of the water, or into the middle of the river, I should say. The water had dried up. And you go and you grab, each of you grab 1 stone, and you're going to take it to the place that you're going to camp tonight. Does anybody know where they camped the first night in the Promised Land? Remember what it was called? If anybody did, I was going to be most impressed. It was called Gilgal. He was 8 miles away from the bank of the Jordan River. Hey, go pick up this stone, not a little one, but a big one. Pick up a really big stone, and you're going to carry it 8 miles to the place where you're going to camp. Pretty cool. And if you think about how large the whole of the nation of Israel was, they probably, when they encamped, it probably encompassed several diameters of miles, several miles in diameter. So Gilgal would have been the center. That would have been where the Ark of the Covenant eventually was laid down, because they would encamp around the Ark of the Covenant by a certain order. Certain tribes would camp in certain places, and the Ark of the Covenant would be in the middle. So the Ark of the Covenant would have been at Gilgal, and all of the tribes would have been encamped around it. And so there would have been this diameter of the encampment, which would have been several miles at least, maybe 5, maybe 6 miles in diameter while they camped there, because of the number of the nation of Israel. And so he says, take these stones, and we're going to pile them up at Gilgal, and they're going to become memorial stones, stones of remembrance. Now, he tells us why. He says, so when future generations of your children ask about that pile of stones that's right there, you can tell them that when you entered into the promised land, that God stopped up the Jordan River that you can see over there, just about 8 miles. You can see it winding through the land. God stopped that water up so that the whole of the nation of Israel could come across. Now, what is the benefit of that? Why do you think God wanted them to do that, set up these stones of remembrance? Yeah. Yes, Ebenezer stones, you're right. Stones of remembrance is what Ebenezer stands for. And so it became a witness to God's deliverance of the children of Israel and the fulfillment of his promise. Do we have stones of remembrance today in our lives? Sure we do. There are things that evoke within you a memory of something that's happened in your life. Now, it's not always about God. Sometimes a song can evoke a memory of a particularly good time that you had with somebody, or a event in your life, or going to the Grand Canyon can make you remember your childhood. What is the cross supposed to invoke in Christians? An understanding of what God did for us by sending his Son to that cross to die for us. And I'm afraid that we sometimes forget, when we see the cross, it doesn't evoke that memory because we see it so often. Now, the other thing that happens is this. That pile of stones would mean nothing to anybody else except the nation of Israel, right? To somebody else, it would just be, oh, there's a pile of stones. What does that have to do with anything? And unfortunately, if those in the nation of Israel don't teach their kids about that pile of stones, what happens? They're going to forget what that pile of stones is about. So consequently, what about today? What if we don't tell our children, or don't tell those around us, what these stones of remembrance are in our lives? It's not just the cross. You know, there's stones that you don't see as well. How many of you remember your salvation experience? That's a stone of remembrance. And it's something that we can use to proclaim to a lost generation what God has done in our life. It may mean nothing to them, but when you begin to talk about it and tell about the things that God has done in your life, those become stones of remembrance. There's a guy who's in here. I said I wasn't going to use his name. So anyway, he showed me this picture. So if he shows you this picture of a cross, you're going to get it. But he was pulling into his driveway, and he saw what the world would say 2 contrails. But they were jet contrails, but the way they were in the air, it looked like a cross was sitting over this house. And so he pulled into his driveway, got out his phone, took a picture of it, and it said that when he began to go and look at the picture to make sure that it took well, so if you needed to take another one, it had a time and date stamp next to it. You know what the time was? 3:16. Now, to the world, those are just two contrails in the air, and 3:16 is just 16 minutes past 3. To a Christian, he immediately went, there's the cross, 3:16, for God so loved the world. Those are stones of remembrance. Those are things that remind us of what God has done for us. And so God wanted the nation of Israel to put these stones up at Gilgal so that they would never forget what he did for them. So let's go on. Sorry, I beat that dead horse, haven't I? Now, I do want to say this about the shrine at Gilgal. You know, the nation of Israel, when they started out, were supposed to be a witness to the world of what God would do for his children. The promise to Abraham was that through him all nations would be blessed. And so the nation of Israel carried that promise. They didn't fulfill it, though, hence the need for Jesus to come. And so even these stones that they placed at Gilgal, eventually the nation of Israel forgot about them. And then they began to worship them in a way that was not right. A stone of remembrance is supposed to remind you of what God has done for you. It is not something that you're to worship. And so a cross is supposed to remind us of what Jesus did for us. But there's some people out there that begin to worship the cross, or begin to put some sort of magical power to it, or mystical power. It's a remembrance. It's just like the act of baptism that we had last week is a remembrance of what Jesus did on the cross, and a reminder to you of what he did for you, and that your life has been buried with him and raised to newness of life. And so all of these things are stones of remembrance. He sets that up so we can understand that by giving us this narrative. It gives us a type of what we're to be about, what we're to do. And it also is a warning as we see the Old Testament unfold, this progressive revelation unfold as the story of the Israelites unfolds before us. What you see is that the preceding generations forget to teach the following generations what it is to follow God and to have a reverence for him, and what those stones of remembrance mean. And consequently, those following generations forget about God, they fall away from God, and then they have all kinds of trouble because God said, hey, if you'll follow my commands, I'll bless you, but when you fall away, then all of these bad things are going to happen to you. And so it becomes a picture of our own lives, and so we need to remember to teach our children about the things that God has done in our life so that they can experience their own stones of remembrance, their own Ebenezer stones, their own experiences with God, to know that he has not forgotten them, that he loves them, that they can recall these things and be strengthened by them. And so they carry these stones, they're going to set them up at Gilgal. And picking up in verse 8, he says, thus the sons of Israel did as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, just as the Lord spoke to Joshua, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel, and they carried them over with them to the lodging place and put them down there. Now that's Gilgal. And then it says in verse 9, then Joshua set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan at the place where the feet of the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant were standing. And they are there to this day. For the priests who carried the ark were standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything was completed that the Lord had commanded Joshua to speak to the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua, and the people hurried and crossed. So here is Joshua. Not only did he say, go out and pick up 12 stones, but he goes out there with them, gets 12 stones, piles them up at the feet of the priest. Now the nation of Israel is crossed. He piles them up at the feet of the priest, and it says that those stones are there to this day. I would love to mount an expedition and go and swim in the Jordan and see if we couldn't find those stones, but it says they were there to this day. We probably wouldn't recognize them. Why did he do that? Not only were they supposed to show them the stones piled up at Gilgal that they could physically see, but the mother and the father taking their children and saying, listen, you see these pile of stones? They remind us of what God did for us when we crossed through the Jordan. But you know, there's a whole pile of stones in the middle of the Jordan that you can't see. What do you think that represents? Nobody's going to answer, are you? Okay, I'll just go on. Think about this. What happens in baptism? You take the person, you put him under the water, buried with him in death, raised to newness of life. You think maybe what Joshua was trying to do when they pointed to the river and said, there's a pile out there that you can't see, that maybe that represents your old life, Israel. That represents the life that is no longer. We've now entered into the promise of God. We've entered into the promised land, to the place that He said we would have. Your life is no longer as a slave in Egypt. It's no longer as a wandering tribe of people. You have now entered into the home that God has prepared for you. What does baptism do for us? Buried with Him in death, your old life is gone. Raised to a newness of life. I can point back to that old life of mine and say, before that point, I was dead in my sins and transgressions. But after that point, I'm alive. Isn't that pretty neat? Come on, somebody shake their heads. I get excited about this kind of stuff when you read that and you begin to look at it. When you are reminded of what your old life was like and what your new life is now, then it should encourage you and strengthen you in your walk, not discourage you. And so when difficulties arise, and they were going to arise for the nation of Israel, when difficulties arise, you know that God is there with you the whole time, that He's walking with you, that He is not going to leave you. And so we see these stories begin to unfold here. And so there's 2 heaps of stones that are put out there as monuments and memorials. And they shouldn't become idols for us, but they should be reminders to us of what God has done for us. So we go on, and he says, the priests who carried the ark, verse 10, were standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything was completed that the Lord had commanded Joshua to speak to the people. Now remember that point. According to all that Moses had commanded Joshua, and the people hurried and crossed. And when all the people had finished crossing the ark of the Lord, and the priests crossed before the people, the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh crossed over in battle array before the sons of Israel, just as Moses had spoken to them. About 40,000 equipped for war crossed for battle before the Lord to the desert plains of Jericho. And on that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, so that they revered him just as they revered Moses all the days of his life. So it's kind of a recap. Everybody has gone across. The priests have stayed in their position in the middle of the Jordan River, just as Joshua had commanded, just as he had been commanded by the Lord. And then in verse 15, you see, now the Lord said to Joshua, command the priests, everybody's on the right side of the river, the correct side of the river. He says, command the priests who carry the ark of the testimony that they come up out from the Jordan. So Joshua commanded the priests, saying, come up from the Jordan. And it came about when the priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord had come up from the middle of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet were lifted up to dry ground, that the water of the Jordan returned to their place and went all over its banks as before. Why is it significant? Why do you think I'm going to stay here just for a second and talk about what the priests were doing? They were commanded to enter the waters first. They're holding the Ark of the Covenant. You remember what the Ark of the Covenant was made of? Acacia wood, overlaid by gold. It was a box about yay so, about yay big, about yay high. It had poles that were put through it. There were 4 men that were detailed to carry it. They had to wear certain garments in order to pick it up. They had to cleanse themselves and make themselves holy in order to carry the Ark of the Covenant. They marched into the middle of the water, probably with the rod over their shoulder, into the middle of the bank, standing in the middle of the Jordan. I'm thinking that this thing is not the lightest thing in the world. I'm just thinking that. And the nation of Israel was several 100,000, if anything. It may have even been close to 1 million, but there were a lot of people. The nation had grown in the time. Just with the two tribes that were going to stay on the other side of the Jordan that they had taken as their inheritance, they sent 40,000 men each across. Do you know how long it takes for that many people to march past you just in a walk? Imagine how much time it took for the whole of the nation of Israel to cross on dry land the Jordan River, and here are the priests holding on to the Ark of the Covenant, standing in the middle of the river, waiting for all of Israel to follow and to cross. What do you think would happen when the last tribe and the last person walked past? What do you think we would think should happen? All right, thank you, they're done. Let's follow them. But what they did was they continued to follow the command that God had given Joshua. Go and stand in the middle of the water till I tell you different. And not only did they have to wait for all of Israel to cross, but then they had to wait for 12 of them to come back. Now, when the Jordan flows over its banks, the Jordan River is about a mile long, about a mile wide. And so these guys had gotten to the other side. Joshua calls 12 of them back. They go back, pick up 12 stones, and have to leave. Joshua is piling up 12 stones at the feet of these priests, and they're just standing there holding the Ark of the Covenant. Why would they do that? Because that was the command God had given them. I think too often sometimes we forget. We think, okay, God, this is done, and we don't have the patience to wait to see what God would have us do next. Sometimes God wants us just to be still and to wait on Him. Especially if we're in the midst of doing something we know He's called us to do. Sometimes we just have to be still and wait. And we as Americans don't like to wait, do we? How many of y'all have problems with patience? How many of y'all want to open Christmas presents before Christmas Day? My wife doesn't. I tried to entice her when we were dating. I have your Christmas present. She goes, okay. I said, don't you want to know what it is? No. Don't you want to rattle the box? No. But she didn't want to do any of that. I'm thinking, good Lord. Anyway, sometimes we just need to be patient. Now, we also have to be ready to move when God says move. And there, Joshua says, hey, all right, guys, time to get out of the water, time to move, time to cross the Jordan. And the moment they stepped off out of the center of the Jordan and out of the floodplain of the Jordan, it said the waters returned. The moment they did that, the waters returned. What would have happened if Joshua said, whoa, no, wait, we got to go back because I got to get these stones. See, God's plan is better than ours, and sometimes we need to learn to wait upon Him before we move, especially if we know without a doubt we're where we're supposed to be. Yeah, but God, I want to be over there. I'm a little bit tired of doing this right now. A little bit tired of holding on to this. I would really like to be over there where everybody else is. God, I'm a little bit tired. I've been teaching Sunday school forever. I'm a little bit tired, but I know this is where you called me to be, but I'm just really tired. But maybe you're supposed to hang on to that. David, I'm a little bit tired of playing bass up here. I've been playing bass forever. Wish somebody else would come and play bass for me. But I know, Lord, this is where you want me to play bass. Stay. Stay where it is that God has you. Be content in what He's called you to do. And do it until He's called you or relieved you and moves you to something else. That's a hard thing to do, especially if you've been doing it for a long time. And so the people came up out of the Jordan, verse 19, on the 10th of the first month, and they camped at Gilgal on the eastern edge of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they had taken from the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the sons of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what are these stones? Then you shall inform your children, saying, Israel crossed this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed, just as the Lord your God had done at the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed, that all the peoples of the earth may know, that the hand of the Lord is mighty, so that you may fear the Lord your God forever. So, two purposes here. So everybody would know that God's hand is mighty and that you would fear the Lord. That's what God spoke to Joshua, and Joshua spoke to the people to say. Isn't that kind of a neat story to see? You just thought this was about them crossing the river, right? And see, there's a lot to learn there, and a lot that we can see. If we claim that our spiritual inheritance is with Christ, and we claim that we're a follower of Christ and believe that God has a hold on our life and that he has called us and he has the right to tell us what to do, then we don't have any right to keep our feet dry. We need to get our feet wet sometimes. We need to be able to step out in faith and do the things that he's called us to do. And trust that if God has called you into a particular area, or if he's called you to do a certain thing, if he's commanded you to become a missionary, or called you to step into the pulpit, or tells you that you should work in the nursery, or tells you that you should be a witness at your work, or tells you that you should lead your children in a certain way, then we need to be willing to do that and trust that even though it may seem impossible with what's before us, that God is going to make a way for us to accomplish that. We have to surrender our old life, surrender this life, and get rid of the old life, and trust that God is going to lead us. See, about 3 weeks ago, or 3 or 4 weeks ago, as we started getting up to the banks of the Jordan, and the people were commanded to prepare that in 3 days they would cross. There's no way that, they knew, they could have seen the flood stage of the river, that they would not have been able to get across that river without some sort of boats, and still, you got to cross. And so here are these people carrying the Ark of the Covenant. They had to step out in faith. They had to step their first foot into that water and trust that God was going to get them across. Now, until that water dried up, what do you think they were thinking? God, you better do something, because we ain't getting across with this thing holding on to it. But they still walked out in faith. They still stepped out and did what God called them to do. So before we move away from this and get to them preparing for the conquest of Jericho and the conquest of Ai, we're only going to go through chapter 8 of Joshua. I want to ask you now, are there stones of remembrance in your life? Moments where you know God has intervened and he made a way for you when you thought there was no way at all to accomplish the task that was set before you. And I'm really going to ask, would anybody like to share any of those? Nobody wants to share. Okay. I hope you have them. I hope you have them. When we stepped out, and Sarah and I stepped out in faith, God had called us into the ministry. We let go of our job where we were making good money to go and make no money. And I know this sounds small, but it's a stone of remembrance to me of God's provision. We were looking at the housing on seminary campus that we were going to get because we were going to leave one job and not go back to my old job, and we were going to go to seminary and start school. And we're in the parking lot of this, or we're in the driveway of this small house that they had on campus. I think it was 700 square feet. And in that 700 square feet, they had 2 bedrooms, a living room, I think a bathroom. There may have been an outhouse, I'm not sure. And a kitchen, 600 square feet. We looked into the bedroom through the window. If we put our bed in this place, you'd have had to scoot like this around the walls to get out. Now, I'm going from making a lot of money to making no money, and you're still going to have to pay like $500 a month to live on this house in campus, 600 square feet. We had 2 young boys, and I remember sitting out in the parking lot going, God, you're going to have to do something. You brought me here. You brought me here. We can't live in that. And I remember as clear as day in my mind hearing, take it and don't complain, or trust me that I'll provide. And I remember, I think I'll trust you that you'll provide. And we went out and we found an apartment which was about 1,300 square feet, fit our needs, was a lot more money than I wanted to pay, but even there, God provided for us. When we were about to run out of money in December, I thought I had money saved up for the whole year. December of that year, I said, we're going to be out of money at the end of January. God, you're going to have to provide. In January, we get a check. Oh, we made a mistake on your escrow account. Here's $6,000. We can live and eat. And then when that's about to run out, and I'm trying to find a job with a master's degree, nobody will hire me. They wouldn't even hire me to write checks at a church. Nobody would hire me. 2 weeks before the money's about to run out, I get 2 job offers, one working at Lifeway and one working on campus. We can last a little while longer. A month later, the job on campus, which is the one I took, turns in. They double that money that I'm making there. Oh, we can last a little bit longer, God. The point being is, we were where we were supposed to be, and every time I saw an obstacle that seemed insurmountable before me, God showed up and provided for us. And I can remember those times very vividly, that even when, through the 14 years of the previous place we were, they paid us what they could, but I didn't get paid a lot. And there were times where it was like, okay, God, how are we going to make these payments? How are we going to pay our bills? And yet I would remember back to those stones of remembrance, those times when I asked God to provide, and he did. And I said, okay, God, just as you did back then, you'll provide today. And he did. That's what those stones of remembrance are. And I've passed those on to my children. They probably get tired of hearing me talk about it. But those are real things that help grow your faith. And so I hope that even though you didn't share what your stones of remembrance might be, those times that you can look back on and see God's hand at work and know without a shadow of a doubt that he intervened and did something that you would not even have expected. Those are things that you can look back upon and realize that your old life is gone. You now serve a God that provides, a God that protects, a God that watches over you. You now serve a God that will never leave you. You now serve a God that will always help you and will not ask you to do something that he does not equip you to do it. And you serve a God that says, don't fear what's before you. Trust me and I'll take you through it. God has not given you a spirit of fear, but one of love, power, and sound judgment. He told Joshua before he goes in there, be strong and courageous. Because he knew what Joshua was going to face. What do you think the nation of Israel thought? Here's the God that can part the Jordan. What is Jericho in front of us? Here's another question to ask yourself. Do you think the nation of Israel, if they had gotten across the Jordan any other way, when God said, okay, I want you to march around Jericho for 7 days or 6 days, one time, not speaking a word, don't say a word, just march around, blow the horn at the end of the day. On the 7th day, I want you to march around 7 times. I want you to blow the horns, and I want you to shout. Do you think the nation of Israel would have done that had they not seen what God did to the Jordan River? I think if I was in that group and I hadn't seen the Jordan River, I'd have gone, you want us to do what, God? March around 7 times? You got to be nuts. They got walls that are this thick. Everything that happens in your life is to prepare you for what God is going to take you through in things to come. And unless your faith grows, and unless you remember those things, unless you remind yourself of those things, you're going to find yourself one day walking, and you're going to find yourself seemingly in darkness. And you're going to say, God, where are you? You say, I never left you. Just open your eyes. Much better to remind yourself before you get to that point and walk with him than have to find him again because you can't see him. I'm going to end it right there. And are there any questions? This is a demarcation.